Okay, so here we are taking a look at the nature of truth. Just as a reminder, because of Kant's epistemology, saying that we never really have direct access to know how reality is in and of itself, right, beyond our perceptions and the ways that we understand it. It brings into question what we even mean by something being true. Okay, so that's what we're continuing. That's what we'll be continuing to discuss today with neopragmatism, which you read about from Richard Rorty, and relativism. So post means after, right? So a posteriori, after knowledge. I mean, after experience. Post means after. So postmodern. So after a modern period. So within these different disciplines, art, architecture, dance, there is a period or a genre of that that's often referred to as modern. So modern dance, modern art, modern architecture. In philosophy, we're referring to modern as a period of time around the Enlightenment, maybe began after the Enlightenment, when people became less reliant on fairy tale, less reliant on old wives' tales, less reliant on the spirits as governing everything. So here comes the Enlightenment, and we're being told to look for evidence. We're being told to think carefully. So that kind of begins this modern movement where we start to look at the world differently, right? Instead of the world being imbued by spirit, being viewed by some invisible force of intelligence, we become more reliant on observation and data, right? The scientific revolution. And that's often referred to as like a modern period of time, modernism. Postmodernism is a term that describes what's coming out of that, okay? Coming out of that period of rationality, coming out of that period where we're being asked to think critically and look for evidence. So keep that in mind as we start to think about what Richard Rorty is going to tell us about truth. So Richard Rorty in 1931, 2007, so he died relatively recently. And I don't know if you can tell, but the photo is him at Stanford, where he used to teach. And he taught both at Stanford and at Princeton. So what we're going to be learning for the next maybe 30 minutes is called postmodern, because it's like new stuff. It's a new way of looking at knowledge again. Just as Kant was new for his day, this is postmodern even. And it's neopragmatic because it's like super pragmatic. It's like the most practical way of looking at truth, according to Rorty, okay? Or at least according to people who study Rorty. They go, oh man, that's like really practical. All right, here we go. I listed for you on the screen 5 different statements. And they're 5 statements that most of us would consider true. A bachelor is an unmarried male. The shortest path between 2 points is a straight line. Every event has a cause. There are both men and women in the room. San Jose has more people than Milpitas. Here's the question I want you to come up with an answer to in the chat. Okay, so let's have everybody answer this question in the chat. What do all of these truths have in common? English. Ooh, you're actually getting you're laughing, but you're getting closer to Rorty's point. When we take a look at all 5 of those truths, what's the most practical way in which they are all similar? They're all sentences. It sounds super trivial, but in a very, very practical sense, all 5 of those truths are expressed with a sentence. Write that down, underline it, do something that makes it very obvious to you that this is a very important point that Rorty's making. The key here to understanding our problems with knowledge and our approach to truth is that we forget that anytime we think about knowing something, anytime we think about what is true, we are stating a sentence. San Jose has more people than Milpitas. There are more men and women in this room. Every event has a cause. The shortest path between 2 points is a straight line. I mean, all of those, whether they come from reason, which I label with R, or whether or not they come from empirical sense experience, which I labeled with E, regardless of which justification you use, you're expressing your knowledge, you're expressing truth with a sentence. Why is that a problem? First issue, words are not reality. Underline, highlight, number one, words are not reality. When we say there is a computer on my desk, the word computer is not the reality that's in front of you, right? Because the word computer is a word. The word computer can be the sounds coming out of your mouth, can be a bunch of scribbles written on a board or printed on a slide, right? The word computer is not the reality that it's pointing to, which means then that whenever we're stating knowledge, whenever we think we have knowledge, whenever we think we have the truth, that truth, at least the knowledge of certain truths, is determined by our knowledge of words. Knowledge of truth, then, knowing something to be true. There are tables in the room. I'm in a classroom with a bunch of students. It is a certain time. There are windows around me. All of those statements of knowledge that I believe are true is determined by my pre-existing knowledge of certain words. Words like table and time and computers and students and classroom, right? So when we say a bachelor is an unmarried male, what that means, that sort of knowledge, that sort of truth is determined by your knowledge of the word bachelor and your knowledge of the word unmarried and your knowledge of the word male. When I say there are tables and chairs in the room, to say you know that, to get a truth, to say that's true, to have knowledge of that truth, well, I mean, it's all determined by your knowledge of words like tables and chairs and rooms, right? But those words are not reality. The word bachelor is not the reality that it's pointing to. The word table is not the reality that it's pointing to. Those are all just symbols. Those are all linguistic symbols that human beings have created. In other words, really, a table doesn't exist out in front of us. I mean, the word table is something we made up. We made up the word table. And that allows us to point to something, an experience that we're having. And when somebody else gets a sense for how we are pointing to an experience, when they feel like they have the same one, they'll use the same word. Bachelor, unmarried, male. I mean, those are terms that human beings created. Those aren't things in the world. Language is something human beings created. They are symbols pointing to our understanding, our experience of reality. When you think about our experience then of reality, when you think about how we know reality, we just said that whenever we think about what we know, we're thinking about it with language. We're thinking about it with words, we're thinking about it with sentences. There's a bachelor's unmarried male, there are tables and chairs in the room. So we're always, whenever we say we know reality, or when we think we know something about reality, what we're talking about is a sentence. We're talking about language in our heads. Well then, if you really want to know where your reality comes from, where you really want to know how you are thinking about reality, it comes from the way we've defined it. It comes from the way we've labeled it, as opposed to what's actually here. So remember this truth, a bachelor is an unmarried male. The empiricists say, dude, that doesn't say anything about reality, right? Remember this argument? The empiricists say, rationalists, you're not telling us anything about the world, because a bachelor is an unmarried male is something we made up. The concept of bachelor, we made up. The concept of unmarried, we made up. The concept of male, we came up with that term. We came up with those terms to label reality. We came up with those terms to express an experience of reality. So, says the empiricist, that truth is useless. It's not really a truth about the world, right? Because it's something you didn't discover it, you didn't see it. It's something that we created. Bachelors, unmarriedness, males. I mean, that's just words that we made up. It's language. But wait a minute. What about empirical truths? What about the truths that the empiricists say is of the world? I mean, something as basic as there are tables in the room, the empiricist would say, see, that is knowledge of the world. I'm telling you that there are tables in the room. That's much different than bachelor's, unmarried, male, because we made up those terms, bachelor, unmarried, male. You're not telling us anything new, you're just telling us what those words mean. Our truths, like there are tables in the room, I mean, that's knowledge of reality. But Rorty's pointing to something that the empiricists may not realize, that when we say there are tables in the room, what are we using to express our knowledge? We're using words again. We're using words like tables, words like room. Even because of English, the phrase there are, right? In this, all of those are things that human beings made up. The idea of there are something, the phrase there are, I mean, that's something we created. The notion that there are means something's in existence. I mean, that language is stuff that we created. The word table, that's a term we created. For something to be in something, I mean, that phrase, that way of looking at life, for something to be in, I mean, that's something we created. Room, that's a word we created. So Rorty's pointing out that the problem that the empiricists had with the rationalists, with their truths not being of reality, we all have the same problem, even if you're an empiricist, because whatever truth you say is true of the world, there are more people in San Jose than Milpitas. Mount Everest is the highest mountain in the world. Whatever truth you say about the world, you're still using words that we made up. So we're still stuck with our own definitions, right? We're still stuck with our own, our language that we created. So reality, I mean, as to the extent that we talk about it and think about it with words, our reality comes from us, not from what's out there. It comes from the way we talk. It comes from our language. Throughout the, 11 weeks together, what words do I use to teach you? Where do these words that I'm using come from? They come from the English language, with a dictionary full of English terms that follow rules of English grammar. So Rorty's pointing out that whenever we say we know something, whenever we think we have a truth, well, I mean, you have a truth based upon the way you talk. You have knowledge that's really based upon how a particular culture has decided to label reality. Words don't come from reality in this sense, says Rorty. Words come from our culture. So, to the extent that we use language, words, sentences to express truth, to express knowledge, truth is going to inherently be biased. Every truth we ever state will be inherently culturally biased. Because if I say something as simple as there are tables in this room, that's already biased by the fact that I am using an English language with English words, with English grammar structure to express a truth. But it's very possible there's another culture with different vocabulary, with a different structure of grammar, right? That's going to express their experience differently than simply to say there are tables in the room. I mean, a lot of this is more pertinent today than it had been when I first started teaching this stuff. I don't know if you've been exposed to, concepts regarding equity and inclusivity, multiculturalism, but more and more there in academia, there is a sense that there's a lot more ways of expressing and understanding reality. But because we have primarily been influenced by European culture, English speaking, that there's a lot of inherent biases in how we see the world simply because of the language we are choosing to use to express our experience of reality. I mean, let me ask you this stuff. How many of you are multilingual? Okay, quite a few of you. Have you ever noticed that you can say one thing in one language and it's kind of hard to find the exact translation in a different language? Have you noticed sometimes that there's a term or word that you can use to describe an experience and you have trouble trying to find the equivalent term or word in the other language? I mean, every language, it's pointing to this fact that based upon the language you are using, that shapes how you are expressing your experience, which shapes how you think about your experience. So if you have a certain culture with a certain grammar structure and a certain vocabulary that's different than another culture, different language, different vocabulary, different grammar structure, inherently, those two languages see the world, think about the world slightly differently. And the truths that are in one may not be in the other. If the meaning of words are limited and constantly changing, because this is what we see all the time, right? Meanings of words are very limited and they're constantly evolving. The word cool can refer to temperature. It can refer to you being, with it. As we increase technology, we have new vocabulary being introduced into the culture. We tweet stuff. If you told somebody 20 years ago, hey, yeah, man, I tweet all the time. But you tweet, are you a bird? No. I do this thing called Google. I get all my knowledge from Google. And we're like, you get all your knowledge from Google? Is Google like a god? We have new vocabulary being introduced. Words always constantly changing. Well, what does that mean for truth then? If truth is dependent on language, what does it mean for truth if words and language is constantly changing? Seems as if our idea of truth as being how it is doesn't quite work anymore, right? You can't really have a truth of how things are because truth is so language dependent, it's constantly moving. Okay, I'm going to give you a list of truths and I want you to tell me if any of these claims have an absolute truth value. What I mean is there any way for the truth of this statement to fluctuate over time? Okay, so if I said Johnny has gas, can that be absolutely true? Can it for sure be true right now that Johnny has gas? Yes or no in the chat. How many of you say yes, that can be an absolute truth? Right now, Johnny has gas, absolute truth. Ricardo's the only one who says yes. Can't it be true that right now Johnny has gas? How about this? Tim was born in 1990 and died at the age of 35 in 2010. Is there a way for that to have an absolute truth value? You take a look at that and it doesn't seem possible, right? Tim was born in 1990 and died at the age of 35 in 2010. Doesn't that seem to be absolutely false? Doesn't that seem to be absolutely impossible? Whales are very big fish. Whales are very big fish. Isn't that like an absolute truth? Like, yeah, whales are, right? Whales are very big fish. Just how it is. Is there any others here for you? 2 + 2 = John, you're giving it away. Michael, you're giving it away. 2 + 2 = 4. Doesn't that seem like an absolute truth? How can we say that's not absolute? Isn't 2 + 2 like just 4, just how it is? Well, Rorty's pointing out that all of these truths are based upon sentences. Sentences are based upon words and grammar rules. So what we really have are a culture's way of expressing reality. That's what we really have here. We don't have a truth that's outside of a culture. All of these truths are the result of a culture's language, even the culture of mathematics and the language of mathematics. All that we have here is a culture's way of expressing their experience of reality. And because language changes, words change, these sentences may not actually have absolute truth value. Johnny has gas. I mean, it depends on how we take gas to mean, right? The word gas could refer to fuel. It could refer to eating too many beans last night. And maybe 100 years down the line, nobody will think of gas as fuel because that word's definition will change. And it would not then be accurate to say Johnny has gas because the future definition of the word gas has nothing to do with fuel. Tim was born in 1990 and died at the age of 35 in 2010. How in the world could that be possible? Well, I mean, it could be possible if 1990 and 2010 were hospital room numbers. Maybe 100 years down the line, those numbers will never be thought of as being years. Maybe our calendars will completely change and will no longer be a literal absolute truth. Whales are very big fish. You know, for a lot of us, or for a lot of people back in the day, that was a literal absolute truth. Whales are very big fish. But as was it Michael and John pointed out, that's literally no longer true. And in fact, in a real sense, it was never true because whales are mammals. They're not fish. So that truth that seemed like an obvious absolute truth changed because our language changed. We came up with the idea of mammals. We defined what mammals are. We defined what fish are. Now they're different. Well, shoot, 100 years, 1,000 years down the line, as our language changes and develops, almost none of these truths have any guarantee of being absolutely true in the future. All our words, all of our language structures and shapes our idea of what is real. So what can be true is dependent on what is possible with language and language structure. You can imagine maybe a culture that doesn't have any nouns because there's no reason why a culture has to have a language with nouns in it, right? Nouns are things. You could have a culture, and there are cultures where the language is primarily just verbs. But with English, we have a culture where the sentence relies on a noun. It relies on something doing something else, or something happening to another thing. So it's dependent upon nouns. So if you have a culture that has no nouns, so that when you are experiencing whatever it is you think you're experiencing in front of you, you would not say, there's a computer on my desk, because that is inherent within the English language to say there is a thing, a computer on something else desk. In another language, they could very well just have a verb that says, hey, computer desking. Computer desking is happening. And to translate that into our language would be there's a computer on the desk. But they don't have a language that has things in it. They have a language that has actions, activities, verbs. So they might describe the same experience as computer desking. And they know exactly what that is. And when you say there's a computer on my desk, they get it because for them, that's computer desking. But see the difference with reality now. If their language does not have nouns, then there are no things in reality. It doesn't make any sense to say reality is material. Reality is immaterial. That makes no sense because their language doesn't have stuff in it. So what we believe to be true, what we believe to be, accurate of reality, says Rorty, that's just culturally biased based upon how your language is structured and the words you use to express reality. So postmodernism and pragmatism in general can lead to what's called relativism. Okay, so here's our fifth theory that I want you to add to your list here. Relativism. Relativism is the view that judgments about truth and falsehood, good and bad, right and wrong, are relative to the individual person or culture. You would be pissed off if you went to court to try to get the other driver to pay for your damages, and the judge says, well, truth is relative. So, what they believe is true and what you believe is true. So I can't really award anything. You'd be completely ticked off. It seems so obvious to you that it's true, that they hit you. It's not your fault. But according to relativism, what's true for one person is just as valid as what's true for another. If there's no absolute truth, then truth is relative to your own point of view. Where else? Why else would people be upset about relativism? What other types of issues would make people go, no, truth isn't always relative? But really the biggest issue for this philosophy is morality, because relativism says there are absolutely no rights and wrongs in the world. It's all relative. But when we turn on the news and we see an innocent person getting beaten by the police, we say, no, that's wrong, right? When we turn on the news and we see a child being kidnapped as the headline, none of us go, it depends. Or if you see news about, a civilian who's, an elderly lady who is attacked in the streets because she's Asian, none of us go, it depends. No, we go, that's wrong. we feel as if it's an absolute wrong. So for those of us that have those sorts of convictions, relativism seems awful. What? How could you justify killing an innocent baby? Well, that's just how our culture says it is. So for a lot of people, relativism is an issue. Okay? So we now have our 5 theories of truth. Now, before I let go of relativism, for a lot of people, that's a very empathetic view, right? To say truth is relative, for a lot of us, feels as if we're acknowledging that we all come from different places, that we all have different perspectives. It feels like we're being compassionate and open-minded to say truth is relative. Okay, so there's reasons why people are relativists. They don't think it's just an awful sort of thing.